Well, good evening. I'm so glad that you are with us, and we are sharing our screen, and hopefully let the computer think about it for a second. There we go. Get all the pieces set up the way I like to do when we get started off here. I hope you are well tonight. Part 12, and the last 8 obviously has been on the war. You've been very patient. Hopefully it's been enjoyable. The crowd seems to be solid still, and I'm looking forward to what we'll do in the future and the falls we were just talking about. When we left off, we had seen Grant in charge of the entire army, and by being in charge of the entire army, he has set in motion a vast array of campaigns. Remember, we talked about the fact that Grant was the general Lincoln realized that he needed. I don't think Lincoln knew he needed this general, but as we saw at the end of '62, Lincoln had recognized we're going to win. There's really no way we can lose unless we lose heart. But to win, we've got to find somebody who's willing, as he said, to do the arithmetic. And what he meant by that was the simple notion that we could even have a bad experience like the Battle of Fredericksburg, where the country would lose at least a third more than the Confederacy, but we could rebound. And Grant knows this. And Grant has already demonstrated that, as we saw at the Battle of Shiloh. And we saw that and how he handled Vicksburg. And that, so Grant's already, really demonstrated he's got it. In fact, there's a sense in which Grant's reputation is one of hard, right? He's a hard battler. And we saw that. We saw that at Shiloh. Now, I want you to pay attention, and we'll see this more next week. Grant's going to, because he's in the siege here by Pittsburgh, outside Petersburg, he's going to get to hang out with Lincoln a lot. And Lincoln, the way I believe it best understood, is Lincoln impacts Grant a tremendous amount in Grant's perspective of what needs to happen, right? We'll see that some in a moment tonight. But anyway, going in, so at the end of '63, Lincoln's like, I got my man, he can do it. And what he's saying, we don't like to think about this, but war, as we've already noted, is terrible. Prayerfully, we don't have that again for any one of us or ones that we love. But what Lincoln is saying is, I've got to have a general who's willing to go and inflict as much pain on the enemy. And if it costs us lives in our army, so be it. And we'd already seen now McClellan and others, but McClellan's kind of the more famous one of this. He struggled with that. And I might too, right? As a general, I think, I could have done it moving pieces, but we're not moving pieces. We're talking about human beings. And it probably would be too much for me. And it was for McClellan. He didn't like to get into it. Grant was not that way. And so Grant put in motion this great strategy that involved moving so Sherman from Chattanooga, where they just had their victory, down to Atlanta. It involved moving another army, you can't see it on this map, over towards Mobile. That one doesn't go so well. It involved moving another army up the James River, which is right here by City Point. That army struggled. It involved moving 2 armies, one from West Virginia and one down the Shenandoah Valley. They are defeated or stopped. The one in the Shenandoah Valley is defeated. Lee sends one of his best generals who is still alive up there, and they're successful in kind of pushing out. We'll see that more in just a second. But Grant stays with Meade. Meade is in charge. Remember, I told you last time, as far as the division, you can think of it, there's a Western Army and there's an Eastern Army. Sherman's in charge of the Western Army. George Meade, the hero of Gettysburg, is still in charge of the Eastern Army. And Grant is with Meade. And again, to make the point, a lot of people like to think it's Lee versus Grant, and I guess at one level it is, but more technically it was Lee versus Meade, and Grant did not directly command the troops. Meade, commanded his troops. And once the siege sets in through the fall, Grant's on trains traveling everywhere. He never goes over to Georgia to see Sherman, but he's going up to D.C., he's going over to the Shenandoah Valley himself. He's traveling around, seeing the army at work, whereas, of course, General Meade stayed with his army the whole time. We noted last time that Grant is successful against Lee, even though he has a higher casualty total. The percentages were worse for Lee, and again, back to Lincoln's point about doing the arithmetic, the Union could just replace those. This wasn't any big deal for the Union. They could just easily, the North or the United States could easily just put forward more troops. The Confederacy was really running out. And there's a couple of moments, if you read Grant's personal, notes that he makes for himself. I mean, he's saying this. He's like, the war's over. Lee should surrender, and he should have surrendered. They all should have surrendered, because we know that they should have surrendered after Antietam, because it was really over then. But certainly after Gettysburg, I mean, it's like, what's the point? But the point was that they were determined about what they believed in, and somehow still thought they could win. And what they were hinging their battles on now was winning the election. If the Democrat Party could win the election, and the Democrat Party, as we'll see in a second, was going to run on a campaign of peace first and basically division, then the Confederacy, well, we will make it, right? So they don't surrender, right? But Grant keeps pressing Lee, just like Sherman presses Johnston, and pushes all the way down to Atlanta. Of course, and while that's going on, of course, the press is continuing to be, the Northern press, continuing to bemoan, oh, things are terrible, things are ruinous. And of course, they're writing headlines like sometimes we get written in our papers today, where it sure seems like when you read the article and then you read the headline, you're thinking, I don't know if that information actually went together. I don't think I would have said that headline, right? In any case, so Grant is able to successfully keep Lee on the defensive, particularly after that first battle of the Wilderness, and he presses him all the way down. And Lee recognizes this guy's not going to quit, as opposed to all the other Union generals who had just sort of quit and backed up. And Grant probably could have at least captured Richmond. I don't know if he would have ended the war. He thought he could have ended the war a year early, but he could have captured Richmond and would have changed the end of the war in 64. Except that the Union generals, most of them, were not nearly as good in the East as they were in the West. And plus, Grant had been with the Army in the West for 2 years. So, of course, he had kind of molded that army into his own image. The Eastern one did not. And more than one time, they dropped the ball, did not move fast enough, paused, did not start soon enough. And so in one sense, I always kind of defend Grant, because the moaning about the number of deaths was not Grant's fault. It was his own, it was the general's fault, not moving at the speed and with the confidence that he wanted. But be that as it may, when the summer ended, this is where we stood. Atlanta was captured. And as we saw at the very last slide, Mobile was captured. So they had gone another way, went with Admiral Farragut, you know, the whole damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead story into Mobile Bay. And really, there was nothing that the South could do. At this point, their only significant army was bottled up defending Petersburg and Richmond. So this is kind of where we left off. And now it's just a matter of us bringing the whole thing to a close. The Northern press, and this is going to impact the election, is going to keep hammering, though. Even after Atlanta and Mobile, they're going to keep hammering all the way through, aiming at the election. Now, and this time, there wasn't a national day that we all voted in the second Tuesday of November. Many states did vote, or the first Tuesday, many states did vote on that Tuesday, but there were some states who voted in October, believe it or not. So the convention would be held in the summer, in August. At this point, even within the Republican Party, there were some people, both more conservative, so really old line Whigs who wanted to get rid of Lincoln, but more importantly, there were the abolitionists. Now, since I've got on the slide here, you see the phrase, the real Republicans. It's my own creation. You may know, if you study the Reconstruction period in particular, the phrase, the radical Republicans. I reject that term. Now, I mention it because if you study it yourself or read it or watch videos, you'll see that. I reject it because the term radical Republicans would suggest it is a radical or a fringe group that is sort of moving away from the core Republican ethos, right? But if you remember our story working in the first 4 sessions, we were looking at the development of the country going to the start of the war. What you should remember is the Republican Party was the third iteration of this generalized third party group of abolitionists. To be a Republican in its initial days was to be an abolitionist. Now, after they were so successful in 1856, remember in 56, there were like 5 major groups running, and nobody would have picked the Republicans to come in second. I mean, the Democrats were going to win because the Whigs were dying. The Whigs were our second party. But everybody assumed the American Party, which is, you may know it more famously as the Know-Nothing Party, they were going to win, right? That was the anti-immigration party. And shockingly, the Republicans won. Now, after that moment between 56 and 60, moderates, like Lincoln, old Whigs, seeing their party was dead, they did gravitate to the Republicans because they were the number 2 party. Where else are you going to go, right? People even then sort of believing in a third party was a bad idea. It's not really a bad idea. It's just harder. In any case, right? So you have the real Republicans, the way I like to think of it, are the abolitionists who started the party. And I just feel like they deserve credit for their own idea, their own party, their own creation, right? It's guys like Lincoln who shift it. Now, because he's the president, it is understandable that you begin to see the party in the image of the president. That's an issue, if I might say, about today's situation. I would suggest both political parties in the year 2020 are having an internal civil war, and they're struggling with each other. And I don't want to get off on that tangent, but one of the reasons the Republicans are having a civil war is because the president is controversial, right? So because he's controversial, there's some who don't, within the party, who don't like that, because if you're not careful, the party becomes made in his image because he's the president. And that's what was happening with Lincoln. He's the president. But what have we seen? From a real Republican point of view, you're not happy with Lincoln because he's too moderate. And so even here in 64, there are some abolitionist Republicans who are like, let's get rid of this guy. So as the summer is moving along towards the convention, there were efforts. And I mentioned last time in passing, I didn't go deep into it. I think I mentioned it. Even some Republicans reached out to Grant. Now, not really abolitionists, because he wasn't an abolitionist either, but there were some Republican leaders in states who reached out to Grant to say, hey, maybe you should run. And of course, Grant's like, I'm not interested in being the president at all, and I'll be very happy to see Mr. Lincoln elected a second time. So he kind of squelched that process. Well, as you go into it, part of what makes the real Republicans mad is that Reconstruction has already started. I mentioned before we started recording, I was asked what we do on Reconstruction in this series, and I've decided we're not. I want to do this one more session next week on Appomattox and kind of what happens, and then a third session which sort of wraps up, which I may mention some Reconstruction things there, sort of a summation and kind of a looking at what does it mean, right? But in any case, what many people don't understand about Reconstruction is that Reconstruction started long before the end of the war. I mean, sometimes the typical teaching about Reconstruction is the war ends and then Reconstruction. And then the next thing typically said is that Andrew Johnson was in charge and he did a terrible job. Well, both those things are wrong. Well, Johnson does a terrible job, but he's actually not in charge. Johnson merely is going to continue this plan you see on the screen here. Lincoln by 63, remember, Gettysburg's already happened. They're already in control of Tennessee. They're already in control of the Mississippi River, as we saw certainly by July. So Louisiana, New Orleans was captured already. And so, you know, they're already able to begin thinking in terms of reconstructing, or what do you do? They wouldn't have used the term reconstructing, but what do you do? This state has publicly voted to leave the Union and has sent troops and armies to fight you. You fought them, and at least as far as that state goes, you've captured them. Well, now what? And so Lincoln comes up in the summer of 63 with a plan that was known later as the 10% plan. Now, what Lincoln is thinking about, and this is the ethos of who this man was, so love him, don't love him, this is who this guy is. It was a lenient, soft peace. Lincoln is thinking, our best hope in the future is to be as nice as possible to the people. Now, Lincoln of the South. Now, Lincoln is thinking along the lines that it was only the elite planter class and political leadership of the South that really stoked everybody up. And if it wasn't for them, he reasoned, 80% of the Southerners would not have rebelled. Now, he might be right on that last part. It's hard to say, right? But he might be right. But his argument is that then being as nice as possible would be useful. Now, I'm going to show you in a minute why he's wrong. But that's his plan. So what his plan was is that he needed everybody in the state who had basically been a part of the Confederacy to swear an oath. But he only needed 10% of the people. So a state, 100% of the people, if 10% will swear an oath of loyalty to the Union, the whole state can become part of the Union again. Now think of what that's saying. Another way to say it is the 90% plan. Lincoln is willing for the state to become a state with 90% of the citizens hating the country. That does seem messed up. Well, it seemed messed up to the Republicans. They're like, that can't be the plan. Everybody gets to keep all their property. The only stipulation Lincoln had, at least in 63, was you didn't get to keep your slaves. But he had no provisions for limiting the vote. He had no provision for opening the vote to African Americans. It was basically, look, if 10% say it's cool, then we're good. Now remember back to when we talked about secession? Do you remember how almost all the states, now not all of them, not South Carolina and not Mississippi, but almost all the southern states had about 10% who voted against secession? Can you see how messed up this is? In other words, 100% of the people who wanted to leave the Union would be allowed to still be hating the Union, and Lincoln was going to be cool with that. Now, under that plan, Arkansas, really Tennessee and Louisiana in late 64, Arkansas in 65. Tennessee and Louisiana, they'll vote in the presidential election in 64. Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, they're all back in the Union. Well, the Republicans were like, this cannot be the plan. So they pass, and Congress passes, their own bill, and it was sponsored by two congressmen, Mr. Wade, Mr. Davis, so it's known as the Wade-Davis bill. And it was an alternative. And their alternative bill was to say, hang on a second, you're going to need 50%, at least 50% of the states to swear loyalty. So again, they're thinking, we'll still have some people who hate us, but we'll have to have seen the change of heart of a majority or some of the people who voted against the Union. But they go further because they reasoned, the Republicans, that this was indeed caused by the planter class and that there actually was an economic piece of the puzzle here. And so they reasoned that they should punish those people. And the way you punish them is by taking their property, most of it, maybe all of it, and never letting them vote ever again. So in their plan, you would swear loyalty, but that did not guarantee you the vote. That got your state back in. But if you were particularly an officer, but if you had fought in the Confederacy, but particularly as an officer, but mostly everybody who fought in the Confederacy, if you had been a leader in the Confederate government, you're not getting to vote ever again. And voting for slaves would be guaranteed for the men, not for, sorry ladies, not for you guys, but voting for men would be guaranteed. Now, that would have been a massive revolution in heart and mind and change. And Lincoln vetoed it. Lincoln doesn't officially veto it, so you probably know in your political story that there's a way to do a veto. We all know Congress passes a bill, the president signs a bill, or he can put veto, which remember I've told you is Latin for I forbid. So he specifically says I veto it, but what happens when the president vetoes, it goes back to Congress. Congress gets a second chance. They can override the veto, and if they, speaking for the people, vote, I think it's by 2/3, but if they vote again to pass it, it's a higher level, I think it's 2/3, to pass the same bill, then it doesn't get signed by the president, but it does become law. However, there's actually no rule that forces the president to sign or veto. He can, as Lincoln did, take the paper, fold it up, stick it in your pocket, and say, yeah, I'm out of here. And that's known as a pocket veto. He doesn't actually sign it and just dies and disappears. And for 200 and something years now, no Congress has ever challenged that in the Supreme Court. And so it just sort of exists. Very few presidents do it. I mean, I've never actually looked it up, but I think it's you can count it on two hands the number of times there's been a pocket veto. In any case, he vetoes it. Now, this sets the stage for the rest of the story about Reconstruction. On the one hand, you've got Lincoln believing a lenient plan will be most effective. And on the other hand, you've got the Republicans, the real Republicans, demanding some level of punishment. How much? Not certain, but some punishment and making what I think is a very fair and logical argument that the people who sought specifically to destroy the country should never be allowed to vote ever again to run the same country they sought to destroy. I find their argument very compelling. It's another reason why sometimes I'm very frustrated with Lincoln. I'm not the fan of Lincoln that people like Ken Burns is, and the guys who want to say radical Republicans. They're a little more of a fan than I am. Now, the Southerners are going to be confused by all this. And in fact, from 63 on, for the average Southerner, it is a very challenging scenario because it's not clear to them what's happening. If you live on the Mississippi River, if you live in Tennessee, it's clear, you're losing. But if you lived in Texas, if you lived in northern Louisiana, if you lived in western Arkansas, you lived in southern Alabama or southern Georgia, you don't know you're losing. You're reading in the paper, but and some of them still read northern papers. It would seem like we're doing okay. So it's kind of hard to tell where things stand if you're just the average person. So that changed. So you have places with specific Union troops, and in some of the larger cities, occupation forces. You've got outer regions, right? So between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and a little bit north of Baton Rouge towards Vicksburg, you don't have Union troops there. It's controlled, but it's sort of like this no man's land. So you still have roving bands. Sometimes you'd have cavalry units running through there. Sometimes you'd have, escapees, basically AWOL soldiers, kind of deserters roving around. Remember we talked about on the day we looked at the life in the country that there were these kind of home guard units who were really, in some cases, not all the cases, but in some cases, sort of dictatorial. Terrorist is too strong, but certainly they could inflict terror on people. So some citizens of the South lived kind of in a chaotic situation. And then, of course, in other places, there's no union at all. They're still living like they've always lived. They're dealing with, kind of deprived statuses. The money's not worth much. But if you've lived on a farm, you're just growing your crops and you're still working on your farm, right? So life hasn't changed that much for you. So this map, by the way, the brown merely means the mountains. So it's a little misleading, but you can see kind of this kind of swath here down the river. Again, the Anaconda Plan, controlling the outer banks. And then, of course, this is misleading to some degree because it's already showing Sherman's march. And then at the same time, it doesn't show like Mobile. The blue should be over here to Mobile, right? All right. So the problem, what was interesting, back to still on Reconstruction, is that when you look, Union soldiers were largely surprised that non-slave holders were not happy to see them, right? So again, Lincoln's thinking, oh, there's this upper class, planter class who caused all these problems, and everybody else is kind of, whatever. And they'll be really glad for the war to be over and maybe even back in the Union, just back to normal life. But the reality is that's what Lincoln's thinking philosophically, but the experience on the actual ground was very different. And whether we're talking Arkansas or Texas, Missouri, Maryland, Virginia, except for like West Virginia, Old Western Virginia, and Eastern Tennessee, and a few places like that, they were not happy to see the Union. And as I'm about to show you more in a second, this is where you really start getting into trying to understand like modern America. So modern America, and you have people saying, how can anybody have a Confederate flag? And those kinds of questions. And then they have somebody talking about, oh, it's Southern pride. What that kind of statement is reflecting is all the way back to the Southern viewpoint in 63 and 64, right? So we would say, and we properly noted, that the war was about slavery and that the Confederacy was very clear in their Constitution to make the war about slavery. So then that would, give credence to Lincoln's thoughts of, well, this is really a war that's aiding and abetting the planter class. And we saw that there were some Southerners, poor Southerners like my people, who thought that also. It's just a rich man's war. It's not helping us. And in some places like Jones County we talked about, they did something. They rebelled against the South. But by and large, the average Southerner is not thinking like that. Now, we might say the average Southerner is unaware of all the story, which they would be. It's sort of like you and me today with the coronavirus. I don't know about you, but I think the one thing I know for sure is that nobody seems to know anything. And the harder you try to find things out, the more at least for me, confused I sometimes get, where you get all these different strands of information from different people and doctors and the CDC, and they all seem to be changing their mind. So as an average person, sometimes you just throw your hands up and go, I don't know, whatever, right? The Southerner, there's several stories like this, where a Southern boy, man was captured or was kind of be talking at times of the armies were kind of just chit-chatting with each other between battles. Like, why are you all fighting? Why are you fighting? And they're like, we're fighting because you're down here. In other words, from the Southern point of view, maybe a very incorrect point of view, but still their natural point of view is, I'm just a man fighting to protect my home from invaders. That Northern Army is invading my state. And so that's the part that Lincoln, I think, is missing, and where I think the liberality issue is not effective. They're not going, woo, so glad the Union's here. Yay, Lincoln, you've saved us from these evil planter class people. What they're feeling, these are going to be the same people who are willing to put on hoods and ride on horses and bed sheets in 65 to, modern times to some degree, because in their minds, the narrative they know is that I was minding my own business and then y'all invaded my state. And so that's that. You see, the Confederate support was still very high, even in deprivation. Now, they don't like Jeff Davis by now. They're mad at Jeff Davis, but they're not mad at the Confederacy. So it's really an interesting situation. And that, of course, impacts the election. The Democrats believe that they can win the election because there's as many disgruntled people in the North, or so they think. And so they want to nominate a war hero, but they want to do a peace platform. Now, this doomed them to some degree, because even McClellan was like, no, I don't believe in a peace platform. Let's win the war, then we'll negotiate. That was McClellan's thought. Still probably with an eye to division. So we'll win the war, we'll teach them a lesson, but then we'll let them be their own country. But the Democrat platform was, the war is a failure. It's a specific statement in their platform. It's a failure. They'll say in their platform, as well as campaigning, on a very racist, openly racist, platform that, kind of warned and tried to stoke up fears in the Northern voter, particularly the working class, that, hey, once this is over, Lincoln will have all of his, freed slaves come up here and they'll take your jobs. And there'll even be worse things happening. And they begin to talk about the dangers in their minds between racial mixture, of mixed marriages, and you'll see your wives attacked. It was all a very stereotypical caricature about the African-American man, which I think has had negative repercussions to this very day. They attacked Lincoln. They called him all kinds of racist kinds of things. They made fun of him physically, and they attacked the Emancipation Proclamation in particular, particularly any hints of allowing African Americans to vote was something that the Democrats really went aggressive against. And through the summer, they're really happy. Now, obviously, August 64, you and I both know, September 1st, Sherman takes Atlanta. So that kind of took the wind out of their sails. And at the same time, the Republicans do ultimately unite behind Lincoln. A very foreshadowing, that's not the right word I want, a fortuitous or kind of critical decision was made to replace the current vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who's from Maine. He was an old Democrat, but really more like a moderate in the time of the 1840s and 50s. And like Lincoln had really kind of gravitated to becoming a Republican, but they wanted to try to reach out to what they believed the Republicans thought there were the what they were called war Democrats, Democrats who, didn't like the Republicans, but they certainly would have supported winning the war as opposed to the official platform. So they made the decision to tap Andrew Johnson as the vice president. And Johnson was the only congressman, I think, but certainly the only senator from the South, from the seceding states, to remain in DC loyal to the Union. Johnson was from a middle-class family in Middle Tennessee, and had basically gone into the time of the war unhappy with the planter class. Johnson would have agreed with Lincoln that the whole problem was the planter class in this kind of economic battle. There's an economic struggle between this very rich elite and the rest of us, and Johnson blamed them for all the destruction. And so Lincoln assumed, Republican Party assumed, that having Johnson on the ticket would be beneficial because it'd pick up some Democrat voters. It probably did pick up some Democrat voters. Lincoln, however, is not convinced, and all the way into October and closing in on November, certainly as the early votes are happening in October, he's convinced. He writes a letter that he doesn't send to Jeff Davis, basically outlining ideas for peace. He writes to all of his cabinet members and urges them to work with the new administration, hopefully to further the war, but perhaps wouldn't further the war. Mary begins packing up the White House. They assumed they're going to win. They didn't need to. They won pretty handily, at least in the Electoral College. 55% of the vote, that's pretty solid victory there. However, there were some close votes, and probably the soldier vote carried the day. So they had absentee voting, although Secretary of War Stanton would allow several soldiers to go on furlough because obviously they're kind of just sitting outside Richmond. So they kind of rotated soldiers to go back home so they could vote. The soldier vote voted 3-1. Now, again, remember who he's running against, George McClellan. And remember I told you McClellan was very, very popular with the soldiers, the Army of the Potomac. And of course, if you work and believe in the theory of Grant was a bad guy and he was a butcher and he's Lincoln's boy, you might have imagined the soldiers might have voted against Lincoln because they theoretically hate Grant because he's so worse than McClellan. None of that was true. The soldiers overwhelmingly vote for Lincoln, 3-1 in favor of Lincoln. And most who have done the research on the data would suggest that in these close states like Connecticut, can you see down here, Connecticut and New York, it's very close elections. They probably were swung by the soldiers. If he had lost Connecticut and New York, it's not like the 44 election. He still wins. It's just it's closer. Right. So again, you see that 212 to 21, you kind of think it's a cakewalk, but it's not like 84 when Reagan rolled Mondale. I mean, that was a destruction for the Democrat Party, no matter who you go. But no, you know, or some of FDR's elections. This was a little closer than the popular vote. And so with that settled, again, the South got no hope, but Grant's got to bring it to fruition. So as he head into the fall, the voting's still going to be going on, but Grant's going to unleash this next stage, which is often seen as the most controversial stage of what happens. Because again, as we've already said, pretty much the war's over. There's no really great cities to capture except for Richmond. There's nowhere else left to go. There's no real armies. I mean, there is, John Bell Hood still has the army that was in Atlanta, about 40,000 troops. Sherman's got like 100,000 troops. So, you know, you could take them in a battle if you wanted to hunt for that army. But Grant and Sherman decide it's time to bring the pain even further. And this is really, to some degree, more Sherman. And this introduces another topic that's worth kind of spending a few moments on, and it's the idea of total war. Now, the veterans of the group, you already know this. Those of you who studied 20th century warfare, and that's all of us, we're all children of the 20th century, we know this, because it's famous from its World War I and more specifically World War II, but even Vietnam, in the Balkans campaign. And the idea of total war kind of cuts on two sides. One is it's the idea that all of the industry and output of the country is focused on the war, right? And then two, it's sort of all bets are off. Right? All's fair in love and war, which sounds cute until you actually talk about war and humans dying and stuff. It raises the idea of what is the innocent civilian? Can there be an innocent civilian, right? And it's incorrect, as I would say, as some suggest, that it's only a 20th century issue. You go back and study the campaigns of the Mongols. You go back and look at some of the Roman campaigns, particularly with Carthage. There are many other wars and time of warfare. The Assyrians were really good at this about 600 BC, where we would say they were engaged in total war. So it's unfair to the generals and the nations of the 20th century to suggest that this is some modern concoction that is horrific that they started. It is horrific, but it's unfair to suggest they started it. It's thought that way because Clausewitz, the German writer writing in the early 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, which definitely did not do a total war kind of strategy, wrote basically for the Prussians, which is the nucleus of Germany, saying that's not the way to win war. The way to win war is to bring your whole nation's energy into the conflict and to bring as much pain as possible and destruction of your opponent, regardless. And if you can think of the logic of this, I'm not asking you to agree, but the logic of this would be, if you're trying to convince your enemy to surrender, a way to do that is to convince the people of that enemy to want to get out. In other words, to take from them their livelihood, to take from them their industries, to take from them their jobs. If you can take that away from them, you don't have to necessarily defeat their army per se, because they themselves will want to quit, or at least the leaders of that army will want to quit, because you've inflicted so much pain on the totality. Now, of course, the pushback from the 20th century is that, no, innocent civilians. I have to admit, I'm on the side of Clausewitz, and so there are no innocent civilians. If I'm fighting your army and you're working in that nation, even if you're just an average Joe person, you are contributing to the industrial and kind of economic output of my enemy. So you're not innocent. You're contributing, even though you're not on the front lines fighting me with a gun. Now, again, that can get to some dark places, but in my opinion, it's something that's been a truism. It's one reason why I prefer us never go to war, because like Sherman, I agree, war is hell, and there's no nice way to get around it. We're better off not going and have better diplomacy on the front side, right? But Grant really, in some sense, starts this. And so again, now talking about the Civil War, you look at the Civil War as saying, for me, again, it's the first modern war. It predates and sets up and suggests everything that will happen in World War I. Now, World War I compared to World War II is not nearly as bad, but World War I at its time was recognized as this kind of total war, particularly for northern France, but there's even bombing with planes in England in World War I. There's some bombing a little bit in Germany. And so Russia experiences this in a very devastating way through most of her western half, the part Germany's invading and taking over. And so people are like shocked between 1914 and 1918, and it's a total war. And as I've said about technology, if they had just looked at the American Civil War, they would have known it was coming. And so Grant does this with Vicksburg in a small degree. After Chattanooga, before Sherman's put in charge of the army to march from Chattanooga to Atlanta, Grant sends him down back to Vicksburg with a couple of units and says, hey, march towards Alabama and cause as much pain as possible. Here's what Sherman wrote about it. He goes, my movement to Meridian, so moving to Meridian, Mississippi, stampeded all of Alabama. The Confederates retreated, and I left me to smash things at pleasure. We broke absolutely and effectively a full 100 miles of railroad and made a swath of desolation 50 miles wide across the state of Mississippi, which the present generation will not forget. So people think about Georgia and the March of Georgia. I think that's mostly because of the movie Gone with the Wind, but that's already happened in Mississippi. And as we'll see next class, trust me, South Carolina gets it far worse than Georgia. Just nobody talks about it. Nobody made a movie about it. And Sherman, we've already seen him say this. War is cruelty. You can't define it. And then this thus becomes something that Grant says, let's do it. We're going to make this happen. Remember I told you the Shenandoah Valley was one of the areas, it's right on the edge of West Virginia. And it was really one of the most flourishing agricultural areas of Virginia. And so Grant was trying to take it from the beginning, and his armies there were defeated. Lee, of course, wants to protect it. And so he sends one of his best generals left, Jubal Early, to defend it. And Early does. And he marches really right up the Shenandoah Valley, defeats the Union armies that are there, and punches out. And once again, nobody really talks about this third time, because it's not really a major campaign, but Early's forces will get into Maryland. He'll threaten D.C. He actually holds 2 or 3 cities for ransom, forces the city leaders to come up and pay $50,000, $75,000. When he goes to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, they won't pay him, so he burns the city down. Again, total war. It's not just something Sherman did, right? And so they burn the city down. It's interesting, Grant, again, there's a good picture here of how we always see things through our point of view. Grant is shocked. He's like, I can't believe they burned the city. Those were innocent people. And you'd want to say to Grant, really? I mean, come on, Vicksburg, besieging that, in other words, it's like tit for tat, right? Pox on both your houses. It's all horrible, right? But it's just funny reading Grant being all shocked and angry about it, about Chambersburg. Again, an evidence of how much strength the Union Army had. As Early was approaching DC, people in DC were freaking out. Grant's like, what are you worried about? We have so many fortifications. But finally, Lincoln convinced him to send a unit up there. They do. They get there before Early. Well, this kind of convinces Grant, we got to deal with this valley. So his number one guy that he brought from the West back to his side was Phil Sheridan. And Sheridan was one of his old guys from the West, and he had put him in charge of all the cavalry. So now he puts him in charge of the whole army in the Shenandoah. And look at the orders that he gives. He says, basically, I want you to clean out that part of Virginia, so much so that if a bird or crow was flying over it, they would have to carry their own supplies because they couldn't find a speck of grain anywhere. Basically, burn that place down. And Sheridan does. And again, you don't hear about that as much as you hear about the march to Georgia because, again, I would suggest because of what happens with the movie, right? So Sherman, if you may remember, when Grant cut his supply lines both to march behind the Mississippi River and get around Vicksburg, but then also when he marched up to Jackson, Sherman had disagreed. And I told you Sherman had actually written his disagreement down in a letter because he kind of wanted to make sure that there is some distance. If this thing goes south, I don't want to be the one in trouble. I mean, he and Grant are close, but still there's a sense where Sherman's like, you know what? You're going to do something crazy. Well, the success of that convinced him. And you kind of already saw that with his own actions out of Mississippi. But Sherman proposes to Grant this move. He's like, you know what? We'll do the same thing again. And this time, Grant's not certain. He's like, oh, I don't know. Are you sure? And Sherman's like, this will be easy. One, there's no army to oppose us. Hood's not going to oppose us. So we can make this march. And having seen what happened in Mississippi, Sherman's like, we'll live off the land. And he wanted to do this because Hood was still around with his army, and he didn't want to have to deal with Hood and trying to defend the supply line. Let's just not have a supply line. Once we get to Savannah, the Navy will give us supply. We'll be good. We'll be fine. All right. And so he basically takes 40,000 troops, sends them back to Tennessee to be ready for whatever Hood does. And he's decided we're going to make Georgia howl. Now, this then leads to one of the most interesting kind of interactions that happen, which again, I think provide great context for when we talk about Reconstruction and the challenges that are going to be in dealing with trying to put the people of the South back into the country. So Sherman decides that it's time for the rest of the inhabitants of Atlanta, those who haven't left already, to get out. Now, Sherman technically does not burn the city down. It burns first because of what Hood did right before Sherman entered. Hood had set fire to a whole bunch of supply trains with ammunition because he didn't want Sherman to get them. And they caught on fire and burned out of control. And a lot of Atlanta burned then, right? And then, of course, there was the defense of Atlanta when it was being attacked, and it gets, destroyed, as happens, unfortunately, in war. Well, Sherman writes, and I'm going to read a lot of this to you because it's so good, and it's a lot of words. Hood writes back, and he's like, you've got to be kidding me. This is an ingenious cruelty, and he's suggesting it's the most cruel thing he's ever seen in all my attention to the dark history of war. Sherman is apoplectic. He is like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you better not lecture me, buddy. And he says, you yourself burned houses down. And then he goes on and says this great sentence down here. You, who in the midst of peace and prosperity have plunged the nation into war, a dark and cruel war, sure, you dared and badgered us to battle. You insulted our flag. You seized our arsenal and forts. Hood's not having any of it. He's like, oh yeah, you think so? And again, this is a lot of words. I'm going to read it to you. It's a lot of words. He's like, how dare you? This is Hood replying to Sherman. The truth is, and what I want you to get here is not whether you agree with Sherman or agree with Hood. Let's be historians, and we don't have an opinion, right? It's tough because we live in this country, in particular with all the issues going on right now, right? I know the tension's there, but try to set those aside. And I just want you to kind of get the frustration as a historian of these. You're watching these people like you're watching, a family with two children who keep fighting with each other. You're like, really? But you can't tell them anything because they're so mad. But you start seeing how both sides have really entrenched behind a narrative. So Hood responds specifically to everything Sherman says. He goes, we didn't dare you to battle. We sent commissioners to you respectfully offering a peaceful separation. You say we insulted your flag? We didn't insult your flag. We fired upon it when you came to our doors of our houses, he's suggesting, to subjugate us. Again, don't say that's not the way it was. That's what I would say to Hood, but that's how Hood has derived the narrative. You say we seized upon your forts and arsenals. We made prisoners. The truth is, we, by force of arms, drove out insolent intruders and took possession of our forts and our arsenals to resist your claims to dominion over the masters. Can you see? Wow, Hood's not backing down. And Hood would be speaking for probably 80 to 85% of the South at that point. And then this last sentence is brutal. You came into our country with your army. Same thing I told you that was being said by the average soldier. And in doing so, says, as you're trying to do this, he said, you're trying to say that it's us, but you were intending to rule over us. And also, now here comes the slavery part, to make the Negroes your allies and desire to place over us an inferior race. And now look what he says. Again, if you're African-American, you're not going to like this. And most of us may not like this, but this is the Southern position. Think back to when we talked about, when we mentioned Calhoun and his position about what the good for slavery was about, which insulted maybe or offended many of us. Here's Hood, right? You are making Negroes your allies and place them over us. They're an inferior race, which we have raised from barbarism, meaning in Africa, to its present position, meaning in the United States, which is the highest ever attained by that race in any country in all time. Now, that last sentence is inaccurate. If you study the history of Africa and you look at the great Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, you look at the Egyptian Empire, Hood's wrong. But that's his position, right? Well, Sherman's not having any of it. Sherman's like, oh, yeah? The same day or the day before, the mayor of Atlanta also wrote, and Sherman writes back to the mayor, but he knows this will get to Hood. And he just says, okay, listen, and I've showed you this part before. You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty. You can't refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a person can pour out. And then he goes to the end. You might appeal against the thunderstorm, against these terrible hardships of war. They are inevitable. And the only way the people of Atlanta can hope once more to live in peace and quiet at home is to stop the war, which can only be done by admitting that it began in error and is perpetuated in pride. Whew, wow. Man, I'd have loved to have been a fly on the wall with those letters going back. I'm sure Hood was ready to fire off another salvo. He's not convinced. He's not sad, and he's not apologizing. And so again, think about that. Here we are in 64. The war's clearly over. And Hood is representing probably many in the South, unapologetic, bowed up. And now think about Lincoln's idea of a lenient peace. Let me be liberal and sweet and nice. They'll come to my side. There's clearly no evidence that's going to happen. Whew. Well, Sherman, that's in September. Sherman will wait through the month of October, basically gathering supplies and resting because he got nothing else to do. And then in November, on November 15th, he takes off and marches to Savannah. And this obviously is the very famous, story of the march to Savannah. He's going to take about 60,000 troops. He's going to break them off into 4 wings, and they're going to march south. They're not going to fight. Well, there's a few moments when some Georgia militia people here and there will fight them, but largely he doesn't have to fight them much. And he's just really marching. And the whole part of the march is to destroy everything possible. This southern group gets close to Macon, and near Macon is where Andersonville prison is. And some POWs will escape. Now, at that point, Andersonville's basically been evacuated. So there's people who escaped and who kind of left behind. But when they get to the Union soldiers, and the Union soldiers see how bad they were treated, I mean, think World War II is bad of POWs. The Civil War is just as bad. In the North as well. We haven't really talked about POWs, but it was bad in the North. There was one big famous one outside Chicago. It was terrible. But Andersonville was worse. And that really turned things a little darker. But by and large, they kind of just march through and destroy everything on their way to Savannah. Sherman actually stayed behind one day because they did burn a lot of the business district of Atlanta on their way down, on the way out. and he stays behind. And then he wrote in his journal that very famous sentence, "Behind us lay Atlanta, smoldering and in ruins, the black smoke rising high in the air and hanging like a pall over the ruined city." And in one sense, as I think Gothman tried to suggest, the death of Atlanta is kind of this turning the page of this old way of life, at least metaphorically. I would suggest in Reconstruction, one of the successes of the South, I think to our great detriment as a nation, is that they restored that in its kind of beauty of like, wasn't that a tragedy? We lost some of it. Can't we still have that way of life? In any case, they're going to go down and destroy that about 50, 60 miles wide, be very successful marching through, destroying property. Basically, everything he did over in Mississippi, marching to Meridian, he does here. Now, along the way, tens of thousands of refugees, most of them freedmen, some not, gathered and marched behind him, to the point that when he got to Savannah, the city surrenders. There's a little bit of a fight on the outside of the city, but the army that was there basically evacuates, heads north to try to get to Lee, and the mayor kind of goes to Sherman and like, "Don't burn our city. We're sorry. We surrender." And Sherman says, "Okay." So he sent Lincoln this telegraph going, "Hey, I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." And so, yay, you're all happy. But now he's got another problem, thinking about Reconstruction still. The problem is he's got about 60 to 80,000 African-American former slaves hanging out with him. What am I supposed to do? He doesn't want them with his army because that's not helping him. Because he sort of feels like, well, I got to feed them, but I can't feed them. And then they might be doing some mob violence. They weren't, but he's like worried and they're trying to feed themselves. So what does he do? So Lincoln sends Edwin Stanton down to meet with Sherman in early 65. And they have one of the most amazing meetings in American history. For the first time ever, government officials sat down with African Americans and to say, what would you like? What would you think would be good to do? And they asked them to explain things like, what did the Emancipation Proclamation mean? What do you think the war is about? What should we do with you people? What do you want to do? Remember, up to about 63, Lincoln represented a pretty strong opinion in the country that maybe we should send every African American back to Africa, or maybe somewhere to South America to kind of form their own colony. Again, kind of a vision of division of races, right? We don't want to stay together, but you should have the freedom to go somewhere else and kind of have your own society. The men who entered asked Reverend Fraser, a former slave who'd bought his own freedom, to speak for them. And so here's this gentleman standing in front of Sherman and Stanton, answering their questions. And in one sense, he kind of lays out a threefold plan. You should give us land that we can purchase. Now, we can't purchase it immediately because we were slaves, we have no money, but we should be able to purchase it over time. We should get our rights protected constitutionally. And generally, you should leave us alone, meaning a Jeffersonian worldview of limited government. You know, just kind of don't bother us, we won't bother you. So after conferring with Stanton, Sherman will issue Special Field Order 15, which is one of the most controversial at the end of the war and for Reconstruction in general, in which Sherman will seize land on the Georgia, part of North Carolina, and part of Florida coast. So basically from Jacksonville up almost to Charleston. All that land, which had been really the Rice Island kingdoms. Remember, at the beginning of the country, cotton was not king, but rice was king, particularly in South Carolina. And they took it. Remember, we talked about refugees. Most of it had been abandoned, so there wasn't any living there. Now it was owned, and this is what makes it really controversial. We won't have time to get into that tonight. But because it was abandoned, Sherman just takes it and basically offers 40 acres to any family or individual male who wants land can have 40 acres. And because they had marched all that way, they had, you know, thousands of mules and pack animals, anybody who wanted a mule could get one. This is the origin of the very famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. And it's one of the most controversial because of what happens in Reconstruction. But for a brief shining moment, it looked like maybe the opportunities that the Emancipation Proclamation suggested would come to fruition. Now, the sad thing is we have no idea what Lincoln thought about this. I've never found anything. If you may ever listen to this, know something and can point me to some evidence, I'd love to see it. But there's no evidence that I've ever found of what Lincoln thought. I have to imagine that Stanton went back and told him, but there's no evidence about what he thought. And unfortunately, as we know, he's going to be assassinated in April. And so there's really no time for Lincoln to move policy-wise to do anything good or bad with the field order. And then when Johnson comes in, there's kind of this sense of, I don't want to do that. Now, that's a whole issue with Johnson, which we'll leave aside. But ultimately, the field order and the 40 acres and a mule is a promise made, at least by some leaders of the government, that ultimately gets pulled back from them. And had they done it, it would have matched what we saw in the Wade Davis bill, right? The idea of you take land from the planter class and you divvy it up to somebody, and maybe who better, but to give it to the slaves. And if you could imagine what the world, our country would look like today, if all those, let's say it, people who committed treason against the country, particularly the planter class, the upper crust of the South, had all their land taken from them and given, and that land had then therefore been protected, how different the world would have looked. You can imagine the idea of I'm sure you've heard of the idea of kind of generational poverty, where there's generational wealth. If, again, I don't want to get trapped, we're out of time. I don't want to get too deep into it, but you understand the premise of how had African-Americans who had been slaves been given land that they could have, not the way it works out, tragically. And so it's interesting. Notice there's a very big difference between Grant, who's now softening, and Lincoln, you can see there, and Sherman. We've already seen Sherman's, but I love this. Sherman was asked on Reconstruction, and he's like, again, we need to make the South so sick of war that generations would pass where they would again appeal to it. But if the peace is too soft, we already know it's not going to work out. Well, one last slide to show you. There is one last thing in 64 before we get to the conclusion next week. And that is that Hood, of course, is still out there with 40,000 troops and thinks he can make a difference. Now, his troops are impoverished at this point. They're malnourished at this point. Many of them don't have shoes. Remember the whole Gettysburg story? They really don't have shoes. And so Hood's thinking, if we can somehow march into Nashville, he really wanted to impact Sherman. Sherman, again, do the math, right? Sherman's not paying attention. He's like, I don't need to chase after you and your poor 40,000 starving people. And so he's able to send, troops back with Thomas. And Thomas gets to Nashville and begins to prepare. Hood will attack in November outside of the southern part of Nashville at Franklin. He'll march 3 times into basically make his own Pickett's charge 3 different times, worse than Lee. And it's devastating, right? It's devastating. After that, the Union Army is not with Thomas as part of Thomas's army. They'll back up into Nashville. And instead of Hood retreating back south, like, we're not going to win this battle, he just took like 3 times as many losses. Hood follows after them. Remember, Hood was brought into the army in Atlanta by Jefferson Davis because he thought Joe Johnston was too timid and defensive-minded, and he wanted somebody to attack. And Hood did. Of course, all that helped Sherman. Same thing's happening here. John Bell Hood, he's making things a lot worse by attacking, particularly when you're clearly not going to win. And so he's outside of Nashville. An ice storm comes in. Those poor men in the Confederate Army in particular. Finally, a thaw happens December 15th, a week or so before Christmas, and Thomas just unleashes a hammer. I mean, he just crushes them down, and it's not even a real battle. The Battle of Nashville, the Confederate fights as best they can. This battle is actually very personal for me. You remember I told you that my ancestor from East Tennessee got into the Union Army after the occupation of East Tennessee by Confederate soldiers from North Carolina and northern Alabama. And he had trained with the Army, and then he had been in the Chattanooga, Chickamauga stuff. And then when Grant comes, he's kind of in Grant's army, and then he was with Sherman's army all the way down to the Battle of Atlanta. Well, I don't know if it's because he's from Tennessee, probably was, but his unit from Tennesseans was with Thomas, and they marched north. They didn't make the march through Georgia, my ancestor. But his uncle, you may remember I told you, was from western North Carolina. He was actually middle-class, upper-crust man, owned slaves. And he had started off as the commander for his unit, his city's volunteer unit when they first started in 61. He's still with the Army all this time. And he was in Johnson's army defending Atlanta. So we know they fought against each other a couple times, but he was then with Hood when he marched on Nashville. And we know that my ancestors' unit and my uncle ancestors' unit were directly across from each other at the Battle of Nashville. So they would have had to have fought each other one-on-one in a sense. So that kind of brother versus brother. After it was all over, Hood's army just disappeared. And my uncle was one of many who just slunk away back home and just, rode back into town. Because he's not my ancestors, I didn't chase it down to see like kind of what was his welcome when he got back to Western North Carolina, kind of near the Asheville, Charlotte area region. We don't know. My ancestors stayed, and then his unit was shipped. Thomas's army, most of it will be shipped to D.C. to begin to make plans for an invasion of North Carolina to kind of meet up with Sherman's forces. But so it's poignant, right? Obviously, the people who fought with these armies in the Confederate Army, you feel sorry for them. But at the same time, you committed treason. And because I love my country, I'm glad my side won, and we're for the Union, and where my family is. And that kind of is kind of what leads us into this part. So we'll stop right there with the end of 64. And really all we have to do now is get Lee to understand he's got to get out of there and get out of Richmond, and Grant will chase him down. I'll show you a little bit more about what Sherman does in South Carolina. It's actually far worse. Again, they just never made a movie about it, but what he does there. And then we'll look at the second inaugural, and then we'll look sadly at the assassination. And that'll be what we do next time. And then that'll be it. We'll do one more after that. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate, as always, just you guys being here and the opportunity to spend time with you. And hopefully this is encouraging or enlightening to you. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate. Email me. If you're watching this on YouTube or something, drop a comment, a question in the comments. Or if you're at Westminster, which is the whole point, by all means, just let Becca know or email me one way or the other. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop the recording now. And you guys have a wonderful, wonderful night.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.